What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Sarah McVanel, and we talk about the power of recognition and what she learned about public speaking from facilitation. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your notes, don't worry, lean back, enjoy the show, and visit workshops.work to download my free one-page summary. Enjoy the show. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, I really had to hold myself back not to ask too many questions in our exploration call so that I keep the curiosity for our interview.
And it'll be interesting to see where it goes because there are, of course, so many different avenues. So maybe we'll just be so curious we'll have to do it again.
Yeah. And maybe we can just start with a warm-up question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator, and do you still do?
I do call myself a facilitator, and it's interesting because facilitation, I think, becomes a way you approach life. It's how I am a mom. It's how I show up in a more effective way as a team coach, because to some extent you need to facilitate your way through those relationships and build agendas. Definitely see myself in using facilitation skills in moving into this virtual presentation world in our current pandemic situation that we're in, or at least when we're doing this interview. So although probably you'll be hard pressed to find the word facilitator on my website, it really is an identity component to me. I'm sure you feel the same way, that it's part of who you are.
Totally. I still remember the moment when I started calling myself a facilitator. I read Priya Parker's book, The Art of Gathering, and there she mentioned what it means to be a facilitator. And I got goosebumps because I could so much identify myself with her description. So I took a Post-it note and wrote on it, I am a facilitator. So proud.
Well, and it's funny. I've never really thought until preparing for this conversation and just hearing that goosebump moment, which created this interesting visceral goosebump moment for me, just hearing that. I think it was probably when I started hanging out with really savvy facilitators that I thought, I want to be them when I grow up. And didn't really know it was a thing. Just like when I was in school training, thinking that I wanted to be a psychologist, I didn't realize that you could be an educator outside of being a quote teacher, in the regular school system. So I think that there's all kinds of really interesting careers that don't show up in any high school careers assessment. And you find your way to them quite accidentally. And it's often through reading books, and all of a sudden you're in a course, or you love what the person at the front of the room is doing in that meeting, and it's just so magical, and you get curious about it. And that's maybe why facilitators are, I forgive the term, mutts. We're just this real combination of skills and backgrounds, and that's why the experience can be just that much more engaging, no matter how many facilitators you have at the table. Although it can be a little challenging if you do have too many, because nobody likes to stop talking and everybody wants to organize the show.
Facilitating facilitators is a real art.
When you can do that, you have arrived. You're the master facilitator level when you can facilitate facilitators.
Yeah. And I haven't come across a teenager yet, or a child who would say, when I grow up, I want to be a facilitator. So we're not there yet.
I know, but you know what? I would be curious if some people who call themselves facilitators as their primary work identifier, if their children have been exposed to that. Because, for example, how many people would know the word professional speaker or motivational speaker. And yet my kids know it because that's what I am. Mm-hmm. So when people say, what does your mom do? And they say, she's a speaker. And if that's in your mental model, they're thinking, well, the first image you get is an actual physical speaker where you listen to music. And you think, well, I'm pretty sure she's not an inanimate object. So let me think. So she speaks like as in a politician. So this is what they get, is they get peppered with questions. Is she a politician? Yeah. Is she a teacher? So unless we have something that grounds us in that lived experience, it's pretty hard to understand. And yet how many people out there, teenagers and, the heads of school councils and, other champions, such as in their sporting world, that they really probably are facilitators. We just probably use the word natural leader or words natural leader, when actually I bet you a lot of the characteristics that somebody's identified in a young person is actually what we consider to be facilitation.
Yeah. And I think very good teachers, very good leaders, they are facilitators at heart and at practice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you mentioned at one point, and then we'll move on, but I'm curious. You said when you met savvy facilitators, and then you wanted to be like them when you grow up. So what is for you, what characterizes for you a savvy facilitator?
When they seem to magically create space for new ideas, for unblocking seemingly challenging, headbutting situations, when they bring a tool to the table that just takes the entire conversation to a new stratosphere. Those are some of the things that I notice, and I continue to notice, even though I consider myself to be one of those people who often can now pull out the tools and who doesn't feel intimidated by challenging dynamics happening in the group. I'm still constantly in awe of people like you. In fact, that's how we met, is you were facilitating a session, and I thought, I want to be like her when I grow up. The more we experience those people and we get curious about, what is it about what they just did there that was so powerful? Or what's the combination of how she showed up with how this graphic illustrator and or this very cerebral person combined with this very curious person? It's those interesting dynamics sometimes too that allow me to see a whole other level of depth to facilitation.
True. And I think it's what you mentioned before, since we all have so different backgrounds, that we all bring different angles and different styles into the room.
And really confident facilitators embrace that. Maybe one of the signs for me that somebody may be a novice facilitator is one that they have to have all the answers, that they want it to be all about their agenda. We can't deviate from it. This was the plan. Oh my gosh, what if we deviated from the plan? What would the client say? We talk about, it almost becomes cliche, trusting the process. And yet really is. That's sort of one of the hallmarks of an effective facilitator, is that you are so tuned into your gut and have such a deep toolkit that you're willing to trust it and go there.
Yeah. If you had to give yourself a hashtag, what would that be?
Well, people call me the hashtag frog lady. So
it's a compliment.
I consider it a compliment. My brand is forever recognize others' greatness. And I love it when people attach me to recognition, to greatness, to being quirky, and that I like to, quote, frog people. And I will go up to perfect strangers when we aren't potentially risking infection and say, hey, you're amazing. Have you been frog lately? And they usually look at you really funny, and you just hope that they're not too close to security that they call them. But you have to very quickly tell them what it means. And then you compliment them. You tell them exactly how you notice their greatness. And it's usually the ordinary moments that happen in the extraordinary that we often ignore and miss, or that people minimize in themselves. So yeah, I would say the hashtag frog lady because it tells me that there's been some kind of lasting impact of the training or speaking or facilitation or advice or coaching, however I showed up in the world, that the intention behind Frog and what we did together lasted.
What a nice story.
I just actually had somebody message me, a client who I had gone in and done some recognition work, and thank goodness the timing was right before COVID. It was for a healthcare organization in the community, Indigenous population. So oftentimes people don't think first and primarily to appreciate our Indigenous and First Nations peoples in Canada. And so the savvy leader wanted to make sure that as before everyone left for Christmas and for them to come back strong into the new year, that they all felt valued and appreciated. Mm-hmm. So I did some development work, and really it was very facilitation oriented because we actually used a lot of the tools and strategies so that then they could go and start recognizing and frogging each other. And somebody just messaged her this week and said, I think to get through COVID, we need to be doing more frogging. And what is the frog lady again? And so she connected us. But that's great. I'm so glad that there's something that allowed her to remember that when I'm not feeling resourceful or when our team needs something that's more resourceful, they remember that. And that's one of the things I think, if you've got some listeners who are considering their quote brand, or how do I make my facilitation memorable? How do I differentiate myself? How do I make it sticky? Mm-hmm. It's what is the thing that that hashtag concept, I love that. What would be your hashtag, facilitators listening to this? Or what is your hashtag? And how can you make it even more sticky than it already is? And then as you listen to your clients, because they'll create hashtags for you. Yeah. They will call you things. They will ask about you from whoever was the organizer, and look at what words they use to describe you. Never have I seen a better branded website or online course or marketing materials than the ones that clearly had listened to and tuned into what the customers and what the consumers of that service or support were saying about it.
Yeah, picking up the lingo of your target audience. Mm-hmm. And then they recognize themselves in your brand.
Yeah. It's a form of recognition because you paid attention.
Yeah.
And that's where I think facilitators are so beautifully positioned that they don't almost have to work quite as hard because, and this is for some of the folks who are listening who aren't necessarily working for themselves, but they're more intrapreneurs, they're facilitators within the organization. What people say about you when you're not there, when you don't ask them, or if you want to be really transparent, you can go out and say, hey, what are the 3 words that you would use to describe me or me at the front of the room or me when you're thinking about me to facilitate versus somebody else? What are 3 words that you would use to describe me? That is how you show up in the world without even trying. And I think that that's how we get to that savvy facilitator level, is when we combine what is the best that I'm bringing with my curiosity, with my skill set, with my tools, with my experience, with how are people gaining and benefiting and getting value from how I show up. It's that middle ground that is the sweet spot of us elevating to the next level. And it is okay if it's just past our knowledge threshold of understanding what it is, because we just do it. It's that unconscious competence level. We can make it a bit more conscious competence by then asking people and paying attention.
Yeah. It reminds me of Pat Flynn. I think in one of his podcasts, he mentioned your unfair advantage is what you can do, what people would ask you for, that you have the impression, oh, that's not rocket science. Everyone can do that.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that you really need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So tell us more. What is a recognition expert doing?
Well, there's very few of us who call ourselves that in the world because, as you could probably imagine, there aren't a lot of people saying, you need a recognition expert. There's other buzzwords. There's change leaders and there's innovation gurus and because those are the trendy things. Mm-hmm. The bottom line is, in my 20-year career in organizational development, I know that recognition is the one single easiest, most effective, cost-effective, and accessible way in which we can build healthier teams, more collaboration, increase trust, continuous improvement behavior, and raise our levels of satisfaction and engagement. And frankly, the leaders where they retain their people, because we know that the number one reason why people leave a job is because of who they report to. Yeah. People are more loyal and are more likely to stay for a boss that values them, appreciates them, sees them, cares about them. So it's not fluffy stuff. A lot of people think it is because it's sort of that unfair advantage piece that you were just referring to. We've known how to recognize people since we were tiny. Most of us were who were listening were fortunate enough to grow up by at least one caregiver who appreciated and valued us. And so we just think that it's just not that hard and it's not that big a deal. But let me tell you, from working with teams who have been imploding at the seams, leaders who have felt isolated and frustrated and burnt out from trying to help individuals launch out of a corporate, very defined identity into starting their own business, and probably a number of other, examples. Recognition is the most important ingredient that if it's present, we can absolutely do our best work, no matter what that identity role, and no matter how, quote, high up you are on the ladder and how much access and control you have. Everybody can leverage recognition. Which makes total sense, because if we feel recognized, we feel safe. If we feel safe, we do our best because we have all of our brain power and headspace for creativity and exploration. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And frankly, that the desire to understand what people's best work is, how can we get creative together? I think we can get through this and we can figure out the next product, or how to pivot our business, or how to recruit more staff in an environment where there's a war for talent, quote unquote war. Definitely, when organizations, teams, leaders, just individual relationships are rich with recognition, all of a sudden it's not so challenging to deal with issues. And I see a challenge here as a recognition expert. Mm-hmm. You tell me how you solve it, because I have the impression, as you expressed, there are those of us, for us it comes natural. So we do recognize people, we compliment them and make them feel safe. Mm-hmm. And then you explained that there are others who, to them it doesn't come natural. Mm-hmm. And then I have the impression that if you teach them, or if you're making this almost artificial effort to compliment someone, we feel it if it's fake. Mm-hmm. We can just read it from the body language, from the tone of voice, from whatever. So how can you teach someone to recognize better? Mm-hmm. And this is the magic of facilitation, because whether I'm speaking and I'm the opening keynoter, or I have the opportunity to do a breakout session, or it's a full day training with an organization, live or virtual, we always need to make it experiential. People need to feel it before they can do it. Mm-hmm. They need to experience it before it feels real for them. So a simple strategy is for you to, if let's say I have 1,000 people in the audience and I can't actually have people divide up and do something, I can have them have a mini facilitated experience in their own head and say, think back to the boss that inspired you most. Mm-hmm. That if you were to try to be like them as a leader or as a contributor, as a valuable member of your organization, what is it about how they showed up for you, how they showed up for others, and what they were all about that was so meaningful? Why did they make it to the very top of your list? Almost always people come up with like that. They made them feel valued, heard, and appreciated. Mm-hmm. So I don't actually have to convince anybody of anything, because every single person has had an experience of being valued and appreciated. And similarly, I could do the opposite or think of the person that you would never work for again. Mm-hmm. There's no amount of money or convenience or other things that would entice you to do work for or with this person could entice you to work again. What is it about them that you are just so repulsed by? Yeah. And it's almost always the opposite. They made me feel small, unsafe. They threw me under the bus. They
my ideas.
Right. They stole my ideas. Exactly. They didn't value and honor my greatness. Exactly. They anti-frogged. And so that's one thing is I like facilitators who are really good at what they do. They try to help people see their own path. Mm-hmm. So I want to create a movie in people's heads where they can envision success or what they don't want to be. And that creates, an opportunity there. When I have more time with people, then I have them practice recognition through facilitated exercises. So an example of that is turn to your partner and tell them about the best compliment you've ever received and put them right there in the movie with you. Paint the scene. Who were you with? Who was saying it? What was the day like? What were you wearing? Where were you working? Or if it was outside of work, how did it come up? And how do you know this person? And what words did they say? And what happened to their face? And what happened to you? And what did you say next? And put that person right there in the movie. And person who's listening, I want you to be so curious that you are now with absolute fascination learning something that is so important to this person. And you have the luxury of having a window into this person's world that perhaps none of their colleagues or even their boss have experienced yet. So what a lucky person you are. Your job to honor the good fortune you have to be hearing this story is to listen for 3 aspects of their greatness that showed up through that story. Whether it be how they told it, what they said, what the story was about, why you think they picked that story. And you don't have to worry if it's right or not. You just get a chance to share that. So one person shares the best compliment they've ever received when they hear my chimes, which is usually they give them about 3 to 5 minutes. And then when they hear that chime, the person who's been listening shares the greatness I heard or I saw in you through that compliment is. Sometimes people break down in tears, and it can be very awkward for people coming up with a compliment, the people who value humility that may struggle. So again, the facilitator in me usually says, the first person who thinks of a compliment, which by the way, does not mean that you are not humble. It just happens to mean that you thought of a compliment faster. So let's not overanalyze this. You get to go first and then you're going to switch roles. So I let them self-determine not who has the longest hair and whose birth date is closest to this day. And, some of the, getting people talking tricks that we sometimes use, we pick a more authentic approach. And what is amazing in the debrief afterwards is people feel seen, heard, and valued by somebody that could be a complete perfect stranger. And immediately people want to start exchanging business cards. They realize that they're more similar than they thought that they were.
Basically prime them to see the greatness in each other.
Exactly. And so if somebody says to me, because you're right, there could be somebody, even despite all of these opportunities, they may still say, yes, but I can't, because probably they've had some situation, it might be 1 or 2 where it didn't work well. Or it's not valued. Recognition of going above and beyond isn't valued in their organization. And actually they value competition because that's how they compensate people. I've tried to do a good job before I go in to know that. In some industries, I already have a window into that. But, that can come up. So we talk about actually it's the circumstance and the environment, not you, that is the challenge. Mm-hmm. So what are we going to do with that? We solution find around that. Sometimes we find that there's also what Brené Brown would call your first family that gets in the way. So you were never good enough. You were the kid who you practiced every day for 6 hours on the piano, and yet you were never a good enough piano player. And you're a disappointment to your parents because you became an engineer and not a concert pianist. Well, we sometimes have a little bit of that. So if I get a lot of resistance despite things that I know works well, I'll say, nobody has to leave here feeling like you are you're converted, that you've, quote, seen the light, and that you're now going to forever be filled. Your briefcase can be brimming with thank you cards, and you're going to skip down the hall and smile at everybody. We're not trying to make you anybody that you're not. What I invite you to do is consider if there is even one recognition strategy that you think fits for you and you'd like to try it. And by the way, it doesn't have to be at work. It could be with your spouse, with your mom, with your cousin, with your kids teacher. I'll usually pick something that's time of year. So if it's about the end of the school year, with your kid's teacher, or if it's almost Christmas, it could be with the Christmas Santa that's been sitting there with strangers' children on his lap for the last 5 hours. Who could you try this out on and just be curious about? So
it almost screams to become a challenge, a 10 days challenge to recognize one stranger per day. The cashier in the supermarket, the old man walking his dog.
Yeah, exactly. What I love is when people come up with that answer themselves before I even have to give them the challenge. Because some people will realize, this could become a habit. And I'll usually sit at the front of the room the way we do as facilitators and say, I'm really curious, that sounds like a great idea. What might that look like? And so even if it is a room of 1,000 people, I'll say, that sounds like a great idea. Is anyone else curious how we could make a habit? And then hands will go up, and I'll say, I'm at risk of putting you on the spot. Would you like to come up here with me and talk about what that could look like? Or if people are at tables, I'm not going to ask you to spend 1 minute as quickly as you can coming up with your best strategy as a table on how to form a recognition habit. And they come up with better ideas than I could ever profess on the stage as how they should do it. Of course, I have many ideas and have had many experiences with the organizations about how they have built sustainable habits. However, what matters the people in the room about what works for them and what works in their organizations. And I'm not a habit expert, so I don't need to teach them about habits. Really, it's about what they're trying to create by calling it a habit. And that's the difference between, I think, facilitators and people who have to be the expert at the front of the room and tell everybody and have to be the hero. Or I've got the only way I can earn my pay and my big paycheck for being the expert is if I tell everybody the answers.
Yeah.
It's actually more impactful when we draw on our facilitation expertise and we let them be the experts in their own lives.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm a facilitator and head of customer success at Session Lab, the dynamic workshop planner tool. More than 30,000 facilitators, trainers, and coaches use our workshop planner tool and save time and effort in the design process. So, how do they do it? Our drag-and-drop agenda builder makes it easy to transform your ideas into high-quality workshops, and the timing of your agenda automatically updates when you make changes. You can collaborate in real time with your colleagues and easily share professional-looking printouts with your clients. And if you need inspiration, you can check out our library of more than 500 activities and exercises and simply drag the ones you need right into your workshop agenda. So check out Session Lab to save time and effort in your workshop design process. And now get your first 2 months of Session Lab Pro absolutely free at sessionlab.com/workshopswork.
And I can perfectly see how you, in your public speaking profession now, really use the tools of facilitation. So you basically turn your speech into a mini workshop, including the public, the audience.
And I'll tell you, there have been so many bureaus and agents and clients who have called me during COVID and said, could you do something online? I don't know if we can wait for a year, because in Canada, at least, we are postponing now all the events, all the conferences I was booked to speak for in the fall are being pushed back to 2021. It's going to be a busy 2021. So I'm so glad we're having this conversation in 2020. And I'll say, yeah, no problem. We can absolutely move it to virtual, because the great thing about virtual is almost every platform has very engaging tools built right into it. Chat rooms and breakout rooms and Q&A boxes and unmute yourself. Yeah, whiteboard. Exactly. So because I feel comfortable in doing that, I mean, if I were a public speaker and I had no experience in facilitation, I think I would have found the transition from speaking on the podium to speaking virtually much more challenging. But for me, it's like, wow, this just unlocked my biggest barrier. I can't get off this blasted stage without making the meeting planner freaked out that I'm going to trip. Now I'm with you as opposed to in front of you.
True. And obviously it depends a little bit on the view that you choose on your video conferencing tool. But when I think of Zoom, the audience basically decides whether they put you on the podium or just among them. So
Yes.
I haven't
thought
about that.
I never thought about that before. That's so good. Yes. See, that is exactly what the magic that's creating right now, this unintended benefit of having to embrace the virtual world to be facilitators, trainers, speakers, consultants, is that it does create a user experience that they can make it how they benefit most.
Yeah. And it must be more engaging in the online world because we get so easily distracted. And before talking more about that, how did you even get into public speaking from being an organizational development expert before and a facilitator?
Oh, yeah.
What made this transition?
That's a great question. And if anyone wants to reach out and speak more about it, happy for them to connect with me, sarah@greatnessmagnified.com. Really, I had never intended to even work for myself until we had no mortgage, preferably when I was retired. I was a senior leader in a hospital. I wanted there to be no risk, no financial risk, but also I define a lot of my identity through work and was doing very meaningful work. And then my son at 10 years old had a mental health crisis. There was so much terrible bullying that was happening all around him that I just felt like I am seriously worried we're going to lose him if I work my 60-hour days and in another city, so commuting away. My husband also had to commute for his job, and he's a teacher, so he had rigid hours of his job. And then, of course, our daughter, we thought, gosh, who was 2 years younger, Simone, if we miss this with Dustin, what are we missing with our daughter, Simone? So we, through a lot of soul searching, realized we need to completely shapeshift our life. So maybe this was the facilitator in me too. I don't know. But I took a week off of work, and as a coach, I normally help people figure out what is their best path forward, their best career, their best version of I'm not a life coach, but a lot of the same tools would apply to what I've used in a workplace setting I could use personally. And I realized that there were lots of opportunities. I just hadn't been seeing them that way. So I gave 5 months notice at work. We sold our cottage. We sold our house to get out of debt. And we basically pretty much sold everything we didn't need, kept the kids pretty attached, kept the cars, needed those. We moved to a place in the country on the water. So the kids, if they had a rough day at school, could hop on a kayak or a paddle boat, or in the winter, put on the skates or the snowshoes. They could walk in the country. They could just be at peace and just have less franticness to our lives. I started my business. Initially, I just told anyone that I'd ever worked with and that I knew and that I thought trusted me enough to hire me. Hey, I'll do facilitation, I'll do consulting, I'll do coaching, whatever you need, I'll do it. That was pretty tiring. I wouldn't recommend that to people. I would recommend getting your core area of expertise clear first before you now have to be an expert in everything. That's exhausting. But, about a year in, that's when I realized that the book I had been writing with a co-author for the last 2 years on recognition, I guess that's what I'm most passionate about because I've been writing a book on it. And we restarted again. And so the speaking came with, once I claimed that area of expertise, I had a few local fellow speakers, coaches, facilitators say, well, why don't you do more speaking? Because I know many people who need to know how to build recognition into their cultures, to do more of it as a leader, to do this as part of their movement and their association. But there aren't many people out there who do what you do. And I just thought, really? You could get paid for that? My parents used to pay me not to talk in the car on long trips. I used to get bribed to not speak. Really? You can actually get paid to speak? And they said, yes, actually. And there's even an association of speakers. And I thought, well, that's probably a noisy convention, but sure, I'll show up to that. And it is actually a very noisy convention, but it's great. And I get to hang out now by being a member of the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers. And there are 16 speaking associations around the world as part of the Global Speakers Federation, GSF. We get a chance to support each other and stand for each other's brilliance and cross-refer people to each other. And it's actually allowed me to charge what I'm worth as a facilitator and as a trainer and as a consultant. Because what you get paid as a speaker, I don't know why this is. It must be all the Olympians that are speaking, and ex-football players and former CFOs and tech startup gurus that are charging an absolute fortune for speaking. So maybe, people like you and I who are more, quote, reasonable. And yet it's more than generally people think to pay for a facilitator. And my rate's my rate, because this is the value. If you want my expertise, this is what it costs. And so that's how it was a very winding path, as probably the facilitator's path is as well, but it was the right path.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing the story in such an open way. I wonder, now that you mention it with the different rates, and I wonder whether it's because you're put on a podium.
Maybe.
And you're not sitting with a group. And then suddenly you become this stage hero, and
I guess the numbers too, that you can speak for a lot. The cost benefit analysis, I guess, works out differently. Maybe that's another piece of it.
Did you become more confident as a facilitator once you realized that people would pay you to speak, or did you become more confident as a speaker because you had the facilitation skills?
I naturally was very good at speaking much faster than most people, because the things that work in facilitation is what works in speaking. In fact, in comparison to becoming a facilitator, in my opinion, and this is not to minimize the speaking profession, because the people that it may seem like you pay how much for an hour of their time? No, it's hours and hours and hours that they work to putting that speech and slide deck and interactive moments and follow-up resources and working with the client to identify what to customize and so forth. So it looks like you're only seeing them for an hour, but really it's a whole life's work that you're witnessing. So I say I'm not trying to minimize the work that goes into being a really, really good speaker. Here's the thing though, when you're a really good facilitator already, you know how to manage challenging dynamics, and you learn it's not about you. You've read hundreds, maybe thousands of feedback forms already, and you've developed a tougher skin. Mm-hmm. You learn how to read a room and body language because you've seen it up close. You learn how to adjust on the fly. You're more comfortable interactivity and not being the only one who's speaking, even if it's a really large group of people. You learn how to adjust on the fly. I've had cell phones go off. We've got this thing in Canada called Amber Alerts, where if a child has gone missing or somebody's been abducted, everybody's cell phone goes off. I've had that happen while I'm speaking. So, you have all kinds of wild and wacky things that happen as a facilitator. If you're a speaker and you're used to everything going according to plan in your 45-minute segment, you've got it. It's 45 minutes. It's tight. We can't deviate from it. Well, things happen. One of my keynotes is called The Flip Side of Failing, which is all around unconditional recognition. How do we value ourselves and others without having to prove it, or you have to be the best, or, these sort of artificial inflated perspectives we have in corporations. and frankly about ourselves. All of us recovering perfectionists will understand about that. And in that keynote, I dance for people. I teach them how to dance in the middle of it. And then at the end, I put my money where my mouth is, and I do a hip hop routine that I didn't learn until I was 40 years old. So it's not quite Beyonce level, but I dance to Beyonce because that's the amount of comparison I clearly am setting myself up for. The point is though, you have everything that can go wrong goes wrong. I've had stages that creak. I've had heels break off my shoe. I've had the sound not work. The slides that are supposed to show people what the steps were so that they can join me at the end of my speech just disappear. And I have to try to remember what those 6 steps are after I'm huffing and puffing. And I've just done a very, athletic 2 minutes in heels. And, if I didn't have all of these really awkward, strange, challenging, weird experiences as a facilitator, I don't think I'd take the kind of risks that I do as a speaker, or certainly not this close into the game. I've only been a member of CAPS, Canadian Association of Professional Speakers, for 4.5 years. And I'm probably getting booked more and at a healthier rate than a lot of people who have only sort of put up their shingle as a speaker for this long. And I think part of it is because I'm willing to adjust and adapt. One of the best compliments I've ever received from a speaking client was, Sarah's the most anthropological speaker we've ever had in our 50 years as an organization. In other words, I've never spoken for that industry before. I interviewed people that they told me would be good, give me good insight. Yeah. I hopped on a Zoom call like we're having now, and I interviewed 10 people. And so I wove in their quotes, and they sent me pictures, and they were already raving fans in the audience. It was actually really, really wonderful. So if anyone was doubting, we've got a non-industry person, I already had 10 people who were like, nope, she gets us. She's going to be good. But where did that come from? That came from because as consultants and facilitators, we have to be guaranteed that the people in that room are going to experience successful outcomes. So we do our homework. We, like Peter Block's Flawless Consulting book, you have to be at least 51% assured that you're going to be successful to be able to do that project. So you need to have the background research. You need to have specifics about the people you're dealing with. You have to feel like you know them in some way. And those best practices in the facilitation world, when you carry them over into the speaking world, all of a sudden, you are like a shining star, because I don't just show up and deliver a canned presentation.
But you see them and you speak to them and you don't teach them.
Right.
Yeah.
And imagine if I just showed up and I just taught them and I didn't see them. Imagine how inauthentic my message around recognition would be. And if somebody asked me, just like you asked me that very savvy question, well, what if it's not personalized, meaningful, and specific? What if it's not sincere? And really, they were calling me out on it. I would be able to answer that question with confidence if I've been authentic, sincere, and I've seen those individuals as unique and different, as opposed to delivering a canned session, the same one for everybody. Yeah. I'm not saying I've got it perfect. I am constantly needing to improve.
We all do.
We all do. Exactly. Just like I joke with my son that he's my child, and I got it mostly right. So we'll just look to his sister to have to, where we worked out all the kinks. And at first he was pretty offended, but then he realized, actually, yeah, she did kind of experiment a lot with me, and she keeps on experimenting. So you know what he says now?
He was also willing to sell our house and everything, to make sure that I can have a better life.
Thank you for saying that. He will say, we'll be sitting on our sun porch together, and I'll think that he's in his own little digital world with his AirPods in his ears and watching in The Office for the 11th time or whatever it is he's doing. And then he'll look up at the sunset, and then he'll take out one of his AirPods and he'll say, Mom, we live in the most beautiful place in the world. We're so grateful. And I'll say, yeah, buddy, you're right. And that's what makes it totally worth it. And that's that's my goosebump moment, is when we get a chance to do what we love and get paid for it. And it allows us to be more available to spend time with the people we love, doing the things that they love. That's like the sweet spot of life right there.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Thank you for the space to be able to share it and have as Saturday Night Live fans will know, my verklempt moment. Verklempt, do you know which reference I mean?
No.
There's a really funny skit. I think Madonna was in it, and John Candy, and a whole bunch of people where it's people dressed up and they're women from Jersey. Mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, I'm so verklempt, and they get verklempt, meaning is they get overwhelmed. Oh my God, I'm so verklempt. Or maybe it's Barbara Streisand. I'm going to have to look at it now, but it's that emotional overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. So that was my verklempt moment. So, and those are just such magical moments in your life, because how often, especially as a speaker or as a facilitator, do you get lost for words? That's when you know something's really landed.
Yeah, nice. What would you have loved to know about speaking before you started? So now after 4.5 years.
I would love to have listened to this most recent part of our podcast and heard myself say to my wiser self say to my less secure novice, quote, I'm a new speaker self, that everything you've done up to now puts you at an advantage. So although the platform is higher, or the numbers are bigger, or you're going to do more talking too than you're used to, you have everything in your toolkit that will be needed and valued by your audience. It is just a tiny bit of work we need to do to tweak how you hold the attention of people for longer, how you more intentionally craft stories. That's probably one of the biggest differences between, if we reversed it, how speakers who become facilitators, because that sometimes happens. Joe Calloway, who is a wonderful speaker, he's written a great book called Being a Category of One. And he's written many great books, but that's my favorite. He, in the tail end of his career, spoke for 30 years, would speak for big companies, make lots of money, but he really wants to have impact. So he actually only now works for groups of 20 or less. So he's had the reverse of many careers. And why? Because he gets the chance to be there in the room with them, see their faces, have a lasting impact, spend more time with them, create the plan, and see the intention through to an actual structure. And what he brings as a gift that he wouldn't have perhaps had at the beginning part of his career had he done the small groups and then stayed and only continued to work on larger groups, is he is the most dynamic storyteller. Speakers who really, really good speakers know how to create a story that is both about a topic or about them or about their situation and make it relatable so that the person who's listening and hearing and experiencing it truly experiences it. I'm experiencing it as if I'm in the movie with them, and my intuitive self is making connections. So that's one of my markers that a story is working, and I don't have to completely pull it apart and rebuild it. For example, now that my son is well, he's okay with me telling his story, and it's an important part of our story, because the fastest, easiest way we were able to save his mental health before we could switch schools and I could quit my job and we moved communities was double down on recognition in our house. So how could we, every dinner table, start with appreciating ourselves, others, celebrating an accomplishment, noticing why things aren't worse, top plan, best hopes, have belief that we'll be able to be successful in that future state. And now that I'm allowed to tell that story from the stage, people come up to me afterwards and they'll say, I'm going to do that. At the dinner table tonight, I'm going to use that, and then they'll just tell me a question that I apparently use as examples, or they'll have filled in the blank. They'll say, you could start your conversation at the dinner table with a conversation that really is about frogging ourselves and frogging each other. And they'll have done the work in their head to figure out what that question is going to be. And they'll say, I'm so glad you told me to start my dinner time conversation with the question of, how was your day and how did you make others' day better? And meanwhile, I didn't actually say those words. I looked back on the tape to say, did I have an out-of-body experience? Did I actually give them questions? I'm pretty sure I didn't have time to give them examples. And sure enough, the people filled because they figured out what they needed to do because they could see their family in the movie of the story I was telling. And then yet somebody else who's right behind them in line will say, I've been really worried about my niece because I think she's being bullied. I finally have the courage to speak with her mom about it, or to speak with her about it when she comes to my house for a pool party this weekend. So people take the meaning they need from your stories. So facilitators, if you are not a speaker and you want to take something from the speaking world, work on artful storycraft, stories that can be told in 5 minutes or less, preferably around 3 minutes. And it could be about you or about a client or about a circumstance or just the funny thing that happened on the way to the facilitation room, that people can see how it relates to your core topic or your focus or your agenda that you hope people experience, and that you do it in a way that people see themselves without you having to even probe it. You could probe it if you want. A truly artful storyteller tells the story in a way that people naturally begin to make the connections, because the hooks in their mind, how you've told the story, is because you know there's a hook in their mind that they can attach that story to. And we're meaning making machines. So you can't, if you wanted to, you couldn't make that not happen.
And
it's going to happen.
That comes back to the lingo we talked about in the beginning of our interview, right? So if you're creating these hooks, when you're using the language, when you're paraphrasing what you heard them saying before.
Yes.
I always ask the question, and it feels weird now after all this kind of recognition, but I always ask the question, what makes workshops fail?
No, let's ask it.
And I'm curious, and I'm especially curious, and we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, but do you think that they're the same elements that would make a workshop fail that would also make a public speech fail?
Yeah.
And what are these?
This is ultimately, no matter what the format is, and I've learned this by, I think, pretty much dabbling into every single medium now possible. It's about the connection that enables the learning and the assimilation. So what makes any form fail? A speech that didn't land, a facilitation that didn't result in your objectives, a training session where no behavior change resulted, is that it was all about the data, the facts, the objectives, the person at the front of the room wanting everybody to hear all about their expertise. I attended a session by somebody who's apparently a very proficient speaker. He spent at least half the times bragging about himself. And it was the biggest waste of time. It's 45 minutes of my life I'll never get back. I finally actually opted out. I voted with my feet by clicking leave because it was virtual. But had I physically been in the room, I would have just got up and left. I was very patient to wait it out for 45 minutes because the first 45 minutes was really good. So I was waiting for it to get good again. But you know what he did? He wiped out all of the value pretty much that he delivered in that first 45 minutes because it made me think, did you only give me some value so that I would trust you enough to buy all of these things you're trying to pitch to me? Yeah. So hidden agendas, playing games, and generally making it not about the people in the room, I'd say is the number one reason why any facilitated event would fail.
Yeah.
What about you? What do you think is the number one reason?
Yeah, I think if the facilitator focus on themselves and on their goals instead of the goals of the participants, and this includes not listening, not being curious, being attached to an outcome, and not holding this safe space. So not giving the participants a chance to be seen and heard and to contribute.
Not being able to frog them by how you show up as a facilitator.
Yeah. One very final question. What does frogging mean?
So frog stands for forever recognize others' greatness.
Mm-hmm.
So when I actually have to frog you. You are one of the calmest, most present, most authentic podcast hosts I have had the privilege of speaking with. I feel like I have no idea where the time went. I feel like we have covered so many topics that are very practical and also very deep. And that happens because of how you show up. So I suspect, just like we were talking about speaking and the connection between speaking and facilitation, I suspect why, you have such talent as a podcast host is because of your talent as a facilitator.
Thank you.
You've been frogged.
Now I'm speechless.
My job here is done.
If others want to learn from you, and before we started to record, you mentioned that you're putting together an online course, and I would love to give the audience the chance to learn from you.
Oh, yeah. I have lots of online courses. So the one I'm putting together right now, I'm not sure if it's of interest to the folks, but I'm happy to share it. It's teaching people how they can create a really robust, recognition-rich culture through some very practical strategies. So all the tools that I use in my consulting work now is available in modules and tools and so forth. But I have an entrepreneurship model for people who are making the leap from corporate to starting their own business, or people who are trying to scale up their business if it's not profitable or it's struggling right now. I have a number of them. So yeah, I'm happy for anyone to reach out to me if they're curious about anything that I've shared, or, I have a diversified revenue stream model. So I have lots and lots of cool things that I do and I have. Folks are welcome to reach out to me at Sarah with an H, SARAH @greatnessmagnified.com.
Wonderful. And I'll put everything in the show notes.
Thank you.
If someone happened to, for whatever reason, fall asleep after minute 1 and just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the entire show again, what would you like them to take away?
You are greatness personified. There is nothing that you need to learn, do differently, add to your toolkit. You are already enough to be an exceptional facilitator. Anything you do beyond this point is simply sharpening the saw. You don't have to sharpen your confidence, though, because that comes with practice. So just keep doing what you love what you do. And the more you have that as a continuous loop, do what you love and love what you do, the more and more talented and skilled you'll be as a facilitator.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your experience.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.